Hello and welcome to Criminal Record, the Daily Record's weekly crime show. My name is Sylvester and I'm the Daily Record's crime reporter. Our special guest today is former police officer and police chief Tom Wood. Tom served for 37 years with the City of Edinburgh Police and then the Lothian Borders Force between 1968 and 2005, rising to the rank of Deputy Chief Constable, and he is also a graduate of the FBI Academy in Virginia. Much of Tom's career was as a senior detective, and his last major role, one of his last major roles, was in command of a national investigation, Operation Trinity, in 2004, that linked serial killer Angus Sinclair to the murders of 5 women in 1977. His work led to Sinclair's conviction in 2014 for the murders of Edinburgh teenagers Helen Scott and Christine Eady, in a case that became known as the World's End Murders. Since he retired, Tom has become a successful author, writer and broadcaster whose views on law and order issues are in much demand. Tom, welcome to Criminal Record.
Thank you very much. Good morning.
Good morning. Tom, first of all, tell me, how has policing changed over the years, and what were the biggest changes in your 37-year career that spanned 4 decades?
There were huge changes. I mean, first of all, I think I was very fortunate in the time that I joined the police service, just by accident, because it was a time when forces were being amalgamated into reasonable size. Look, before the 1960s, there was not very small forces around. And of course, we know now that that size of unit can't handle big or major investigations. So I was lucky in that regard. I was also lucky in that I joined when there were good people who had the time to train you. And I can't emphasize that enough. To be taught properly how to work an area and how to be a detective, how to be a street detective is hugely important. You don't learn that at the police college. You learn it from wiser heads than you, older heads than you. And I was really lucky in that I had some super tutors. Didn't always appreciate it at the time as they told you off, but I really did. Now, how have things changed? Okay, the changed in 2 ways, Norman, 2 big ways. One was the coming of drugs. The coming of heroin in the mid-70s changed everything, and that has never changed back. Many trends come and go, but drugs and the influence of drugs on our health, on our crime, on our societies, on our well-being, on our life and death has not changed. That was a huge, huge change in policing. And I was there, I saw it happen. The second big change that's taken place is, of course, the coming of the internet. And we now know, I mean, we're speaking just now over the internet, and we now know that 50% or more of crime that's committed is actually committed online. So if you are going to be a victim of crime, you probably won't be attacked in the street. You probably have your bank account rifled online. These are the huge differences that have taken place in my lifetime.
Tom, you were involved in the original investigation into the deaths of Helen and Christine in 1977, then led the reinvestigation 27 years later when the original evidence was reviewed using the latest sort of forensic technology. Had you had the forensic tools then in 1977, do you think the case would have been solved? I was thinking in terms of even things like CCTV. Police officers in 1977 just didn't have the tools that they have now.
Norman, it was like the Dark Ages. And when we came to review the case in 2004 and look back and dig out the original statements, we couldn't believe. I wrote a book about the World's End Murders, and I actually said in the opening paragraph, it is difficult now to remember all the things we did not know and could not do back in 1977. And that's the truth of it. Not only did we not have any CCTV, we had no mobile phone signals, we had no information from bank cash machines, we had no information from telecommunications at all. But more than that, we had inadequate systems of dealing with major investigations. We were still using the old paper card system that had been evolved way back in the 19th century. In fact, I saw the original admin set up for the original Jack the Ripper, 1881 in London. I visited the Black Museum at Scotland Yard and saw some of the original paperwork for the Ripper murders. And you would have recognised it in 1977. That's how antiquated we were. And that was a huge, huge handicap. And, you know, quite rightly, and we're going to talk about the development of forensic science and all the wonders that brought. But the other thing that's often overlooked is the marvellous step forward that computers brought us, and the Holmes system, Home Office Large Major Inquiry System. Nobody finds computers sexy. Well, very few people find them sexy. But let me tell you, the Major Inquiry System, the computerized system, has solved any number of serious crimes. It was a huge boon. Big, big, big advantage.
Yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of the fact that the suggestion was at the time this might have been a local crime local to the Edinburgh area. As it turned out, the two, Sinclair and his associate at the time, Gordon Hamilton, were both from the west of Scotland. That possibly now with intelligence gathering, computer, these are names that might have been flagged up at the time.
Absolutely. The thing was, Norman, that there was good reason to believe that. I mean, I was on duty that day, the day that Helen and Christine's bodies were found, on the 16th of October, Sunday the 16th of October 1977. Never forget it. I came on at 2:00 that afternoon. I was the youngest detective sergeant in the force, and I was stuck in the office. They didn't think I was fit and ready to go out into the public, and they were probably right. But so I was doing admin stuff in the office, and I remember coming in and feeling an atmosphere that I've never felt before. And I was busy trying to find cars and trying to call out people who didn't have nobody had a standing murder squad at that time. Trying to find office space, trying to get the admin system all set up. And I remember distinctly an older detective sergeant coming back later on. He'd been down at the scene where the girls' bodies were found. And he said to one of his mates in the office, he said, "They've done this before and they'll do it again." And I'll never forget that. He knew that this was something different, because Helen and Christine had not been killed in the usual way, in an act of passion or temper or drunkenness or lust. They had been executed. They'd been coldly killed, and they'd been left in places quite deliberately where there were good lines of sight. Everything had been planned. And much later, 10 years later, I went to the FBI to study, as you alluded to in your introduction. And I got involved with the behavioural sciences unit there, the Silence of the Lambs crowd. And they were really fascinating. And they talked about organised crime scenes as opposed to disorganised. The usual crime scenes are disorganised, stuff lying all over the place because it's panic, it's temper, and people run away. This was an organised crime scene. Nothing had been left at the crime scene. There was no foreign objects left. Most of the clothes of the girls had been taken away. Only Helen Scott's coat had been left. And of course, ultimately, that proved to be the vital piece of information. So coming back to your question, sorry to digress, but yeah, there was every reason to believe it would be a local crime, because most murders are local. Most murders are committed by people that know the victim, or that there is a degree of relationship with the victim. So yeah, that was the first assumption. And of course, it was a very wrong assumption.
Tom, we know that Sinclair was also suspected of a number of other murders around that same year, including 3 Glasgow women, Anna Kenny, Hilda Macaulay and Agnes Cooney, who, like Helen and Christian, disappeared after a night out. They'd been I think 2 of them had been at a kind of dance. One had been at a kind of local bar in Glasgow. How many murders do you think Sinclair may have committed? We know he's been convicted of 3 murders and 1 culpable homicide. How many murders do you think he may have committed? And would there be a justification taking a fresh look at other cases, given recent developments in forensic science, or do we know as much as we're ever going to know about his crimes?
Yes, we do. Remember that we've got full DNA profiles of Angus Sinclair and Gordon Hamilton, his co-accused, on our database. So if anything springs up now, they will be automatically checked. How many people did Sinclair kill? Well, We know he's been convicted for killing 4 girls and young women. I am certain that he killed Anna Kenny, Hilda Macaulay, Agnes Cooney, and I'm certain because the details and the modus operandi of the crimes were identical, and I mean identical, to the World's End case. In other words, Saturday night, girls had been drinking but were not drunk, picked up in a vehicle, transported away, killed with their own underwear, left in areas which were known to Sinclair, sexually assaulted. The pattern there was complete. Now, when we were investigating Angus Sinclair in 2004, some of the Strathclyde officers did a super exercise and constructed the Scottish Homicide Database. And we looked at every murder of a female, every murder of a woman, going back to about 1960. Right? And first of all, it was horrifying how many there were. That's the first thing to say. It was horrifying how many there were. I think there was about 1,200 over. But the second thing to say is that these unique factors that I've just mentioned were only present in the murders we're talking about. So there was a unique, almost like a fingerprint of modus operandi over the deaths of all these women. Now, can I just finish one thing and say, tragically, the forensic evidence in the Glasgow cases, Anna, Hilda, and Agnes, was lost. And we were very fortunate in 1977 to have in Edinburgh a fantastic biologist called Lester Knibb, a young man who went to the scene, who took samples and preserved them. This is the important bit, and preserved them with an audit trail. Because I often say that to people now. I was speaking about the World's End murders the other night there, and I was saying to the audience, remember this, that when you see some news story about an old case, a 45-year-old case being solved by DNA, the wonders of new DNA, remember that it's only solved because a proper job was done at the time, right? That the evidence was taken at the time, that it was preserved at the time in a way that it could be examined and give up its secrets all these years later. And that's the debt of gratitude that we're due to Lester Knibb and our forensic science boys here in Lothian and Borders. And in my book, I pay credit to them and say that they were absolute key to it, because they had the vision and they had the presence to keep these productions. Unfortunately, at that time, the systems in Strathclyde were not as good, and their forensic materials were lost. And that's a tragedy, because I think that's denied justice to the families of Anna and Hilda and Agnes.
We also know that Sinclair was being linked to a murder of a Francis Barker, which a Thomas Young, a lorry driver, was convicted. Now, the link there was the woman, the victim was from Maryhill, the same kind of area as Sinclair was living at the time. Do you believe that Francis Barker was a possible victim? We know Young's now dead, of course, but he always kind of played his innocence in that matter. Do you think Barker could be Francis Barker could be a possible victim?
Yes, I do. I think that Angus Sinclair killed Francis Barker. And I think that Thomas Ross Young was wrongly convicted for that crime. Now, can I just say, don't shed crocodile tears for Thomas Ross Young, because he was a convicted rapist, and there are other serious crimes which he had to account for. But actually, I believe, and it's a personal belief, and the court took a different view, and the court, it's not my opinion that matters, but certainly I and most of the other detectives who were working on Operation Trinity, if not all, believed that he was responsible for the murder of Francis Barker.
There's also another murder which he was quite friendly with, an Eddie Katongo, who was a photographer from the Dumbarton area. He died in a fire at his home, or was found dead in his fire in his home a number of years ago. Was that murder ever a feature at all?
Yes, we looked very long and hard at Eddie Katongo. The problem was there, of course, that it's completely without the pattern of Sinclair's offending, because all his other victims were women, and all these other victims were sexually motivated. Pardon me. Sorry, I'm clearing my throat. And the other thing to say about Eddie Cotonio is Eddie Cotonio was the kind of guy that there were quite a number of people who would have been queuing up to kill him. so there were no shortage of suspects or people who might have wanted to kill Eddie. Eddie was he was a funny guy. He was a pornographer, and he had vast collections of pornographic photographs. And we know that Angus Sinclair at one time indulged in that, and he knew Eddie Cotonio. Now, Eddie Cotonio died of blunt force injury. His skull was caved in, but then his house was set on fire. So, the fact that Angus Sinclair knew him made us look long and hard. But you've got to be careful, Norman. You've got to be really careful that you don't start to associate murders with people just because they're there. I mean, it's a classic thing to say, oh, well, we've got Angus Sinclair, we've got Peter Tobin, we've got Robert Black, the child abductor. And therefore, if we get a crime at the same time as they were active, it must be them that was responsible. That's sloppy thinking. What you've got to do is you've got to go right back to basics, and you've got to investigate these crimes one at a time. Is it possible that Angus Sinclair killed Eddie Cotonio? Yes, it's possible. He tried to concoct a false alibi around about that time. But remember, he was so involved in other criminal activity too, that he might have not been trying to cover up the death of Eddie Cotonio as much as some other nefarious activity. Because one of the things we learned as we went along with Angus Sinclair is that it's wrong to think that these criminals are only sexual predators or are only a certain category of criminals. What we found with Angus Sinclair was he offended across a wide range of criminality, everything from housebreaking to assault and robbery to pornography. He was also a first-class painter and decorator, and at the weekends he went out and abducted and murdered young women, right? And he carried out all this activity in discrete boxes, as it were, none of the twain shall meet, none of which overflowed into the next. He was a highly organised killer. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, I know it's controversial, but I think Angus Sinclair is probably the most dangerous man to walk the face of Scotland in the 20th century. And he had plenty of good company in that regard. But when you think about it, Angus Sinclair was only at liberty for 12 years of his adult life. And yet he killed all these women. And don't forget, he raped and sexually assaulted a dozen children, at least, into the bargain, because he was caught for that too. So when you look at the concentration of his offending, over 12 years, just 12 years, you see someone that is just a predator, an apex predator who is capable of the most dreadful crimes. And I think he was the most dangerous man there was. And to look at him, when we saw him, that's the thing, Norman, to look at him. I mean, you look more like a serial killer than he does. And I'm not saying you look like a serial killer. I'm just saying you look more like a serial killer than he does. Because he was a little grey, innocuous man that you wouldn't have looked twice at in the street.
Until intents purposes, he was a law-abiding citizen. He worked as a painter and decorator. We know that. His wife was a nurse. He lived in quite a nice house in Glasgow. There'd be nobody would suspect him. It's not somebody you would suspect. If the police are appealing for information on a murder or whatever, you wouldn't look at your neighbour and think Angus Sinclair's the man, isn't it? He would just be so anonymous. That's right.
The other thing was that, you see, his first victim was when he was 15 years old, Catherine Rehill, in a highly organised, sexually motivated killing. But then when he came out of prison, he got himself involved in other kinds of criminality, armed robbery being one of them. So I think it's understandable that the police, they would know Angus Sinclair, but they would see him as an armed robber. And this is one of the mistakes we used to make. I think we're better at it now. Is you tend to see people in certain categories, and you forget that actually people can range across a number of categories, and that's what Angus Sinclair did.
I'm going to ask you that you've kind of answered the question in many ways, but where do you think Sinclair stands in the kind of pantheon of serial killers? Is he as bad as you can get? I was thinking of people like Ian Brady, Moore's murderer, Peter Sutcliffe, Yorkshire Ripper, Dennis Nielsen, of course, another Scot, and you mentioned Peter Tobin. Is he perhaps, I don't know if you can't have a league table, but he be as bad, if not worse, than these individuals?
Well, I mean, it depends how you define it. First of all, I've spent the last 10 minutes talking about Angus Sinclair, but actually I don't like to talk about these people, and I certainly don't like to glorify them. And I think too much of that has been done, to be honest. We talk too much, and you see television programs on about the worst serial killers and all the rest of it. I have met too many of these people, and I don't like to glorify them in any way. Okay, but your question. So Peter Sutcliffe killed 13 women. So in terms of numbers, he's way up there. Ian Brady, horrendous murders with Myra Hindley, abduction, torture, terrible torture of young people. They come into a category of their own. I don't know. I mean, it's not something I want to think about too much, to be honest with you. But again, I say, when you consider that Sinclair was only at liberty for 12 years of his adult life, and the damage that he did is quite extraordinary. It's disgraceful, utterly disgraceful.
You alluded to this earlier, but you were a detective when Edinburgh became flooded by heroin in the late 1970s, early 1980s, which in turn became linked to the rise of HIV infection in the city. A lot of us people maybe know the story through the book and the film Trainspotting, which kind of inspired that, which came out of that. What are your recollections of that period in Edinburgh, and what do you think maybe should have been done differently then, or did you tackle the situation as best as you could?
I think we were caught unawares by it. I mean, now we know that it was all to do with disruption in the Middle East and problems in Iran, and there was a flood of Afghan heroin made its way to Britain, and very quickly in the mid-70s got itself into the housing schemes. And I mean, I remember it very well. I was a beat cop in one of the busiest areas, and one of our local middle order criminals, a minor order criminal actually, turned up with a brand new red V12 E-Type Jaguar sports car. And we thought, I wonder where he got that. I wonder what he's been up to. Well, of course, what we didn't know was he was the first heroin dealer. And it went on from there, and it caused absolute mayhem through the 70s, and reached its first peak, because heroin has come and gone in waves, reached its first peak in the 80s, and took a terrible toll. I mean, when I was out of the CID for a short time in the 1980s, came back in 1986 as detective superintendent, one of the first things I asked the criminal intelligence to do was to say, where are all our major criminals who were active 2 or 3 years ago? Where are they? Have they dropped out of sight? Are they in prison? Have they moved on? Or are we missing something? And they came back to me and said, they're all dead. They're all dead. It took a huge toll on our young people, and of course continues to do so. And that's the disgrace of it, Norman. It continues to do so. We can't afford to lose the young people from Scotland that we are losing year in, year out to drugs.
One measure to combat the spread of HIV in Edinburgh was the licensing of the city's sauna and massage parlours. This is in the 1980s, with owners encouraged to hand out condoms and take other protective measures as a condition of their licence. It's been said that there was a kind of secret agreement involving the police and the Crown Office to kind of turn a bit of a blind eye to the activities, for the greater good, as it were. Was this true? Was there a bit of a kind of gentleman's agreement not to prosecute or raid the premises on
Yeah,
standards?
well, you can call it a gentleman's agreement if you like. I don't think there's many gentlemen involved. I was certainly involved in it. What actually happened? It was nothing to initially. It was nothing to do with HIV and AIDS. What happened in 1983? We had the murder of a sex worker called Sheila Anderson, and while we were investigating that, we discovered that the whole of the street sex scene had changed under our noses, and we hadn't noticed it. In the space of 6 months, a lot of the older streetwise women had disappeared and had been replaced by very young, I'm talking very young, teenagers, heroin dependent, or supporting people who were heroin dependent, who were on the streets, chaotic and extremely vulnerable. We also discovered that we were being visited by violent criminals, serious heavyweight criminals from the West, from your part of the world, from the north of England, and from Aberdeen and Dundee, people coming to Edinburgh, to Leith, basically to predate on these young girls. And that cost us, I mean, we knew then that we faced a very, very serious issue, because if we did not do something pretty radical, we'd have more murders. Because the level of violence which we uncovered was unprecedented. And we were very lucky that actually Sheila Anderson was the only person that was murdered, because a lot of people had been violently attacked. So what we did was we decided to change completely and look at the sex workers not as nuisance criminals, which we traditionally had done and which everybody traditionally had done, but look at them as on them as victims. And most of them were victims. Most of them were people who had been in the care of the local authority, had become in children's homes. Most of them had been in care and were out on the streets. Something like 95% of street prostitutes had been in care. It was a disgrace. And there they were, and they were like lambs to slaughter. So what we did was we formed a partnership with some sex workers help group, which actually initially was set up by the Church of Scotland, of all people, and they were absolutely first class, a group called Shiva, a group called Scots Pep. And we appointed a very, very good, this was the key to it, we had a very, very good street cop called Pat Ellis. She was a highly experienced and no nonsense, can I tell you, policewoman, with a lot of experience. And we appointed her as a prostitute liaison officer. And she was the bridge. Because the other thing that had happened was we had lost all intelligence and information from the sex workers. Because coming from the backgrounds they did, Norman, coming from care homes, they didn't trust authority. And the last people they would go and speak to was the police. So we had to break down these barriers. And so what we did in association with the Procurator Fiscal was that we formed what they called a zone of discretionary prosecution. It wasn't a tolerance zone, as has often been titled, but the deal was simply this. If you, meaning the sex workers, restrict yourself to a dozen girls on the street in this geographical area, and there is no pimping, there is no drugs, there is no assaults and robberies, and there's no complaints from the public, then we, the police, will find other things to do. Okay? But if you breach any of these conditions, we'll come back and enforce the law. It was as simple as that. That was the deal. And that held good and I think saved many lives. Now, you talked about HIV and AIDS. We started this project as a public safety exercise to protect these girls. It transformed into a public health exercise when HIV and AIDS came on board. And Norman, it worked. It worked. It was informal. It was messy at times, but thanks to people like Pat Ellis, who could smooth over problems and get the job done, we had no more murders or serious assaults. Anything we did have was solved within hours because we had good relationships with the girls. And there was not the spread of HIV, the heterosexual spread of HIV and AIDS that we feared and suspected. The same could not be said of our rent boys. Unfortunately, they were one of the areas that we just we just never managed to get a grip of, unfortunately, although we tried very hard. So that was the story about the so-called tolerance zones. Now, the other thing to say about street prostitution is people fixate on street prostitution, but it is only ever the tip of the iceberg. The majority of the sex industry operates not on the streets, but in saunas, in flats, in hotels, in brothels, and in various other places. The street is just the visible tip of that huge iceberg, which is the sex industry. So the next thing we had to do was to find a way of getting it into the various saunas and massage parlours that had sprung up all over the central belt of Scotland, actually. And so the City Council, wisely, in my view, decided to licence them. And this gave us, of course, an in. It meant we could go in and inspect them. It meant that public health could go in. It meant the police could go in. It meant the fire service could go in to check on safety. It meant we found out who was running them, who was going about there, and it meant we could control and visit, and we could prevent underagers and people who had been trafficked ending up in the saunas. And so the saunas, and at one time there was something about 30 or 40, I think, in Edinburgh, and gradually it dwindled away because, as I was saying right in my introduction, the coming of the internet changed everything. And now the sex industry is almost entirely online. I mean, you'll get some street sex workers, of course you will. There'll always be one or two, but for the most part, the sex industry has gone online, and the saunas have fallen away. And I think last time I checked, I think there were only 2 saunas operating in Edinburgh. So that's the story of the saunas.
There was a police operation in 2013 under Sir Stephen House, which targeted a lot of the saunas in Edinburgh, with the licensing scheme eventually being withdrawn. Was that a kind of good thing? Was that inevitable, or it didn't really matter because at the end of the day, all the sex work was graduating, even then, online?
No, it was a very unwise move, and it was unfortunately, Norman, we suffer from a lack of institutional memory within the police service. And we're very prone to the sort of new broom approach. Somebody new comes in and they dismiss without proper consideration all the things that have gone on in the past. And I was aware of that, and I thought, what are they trying to achieve? And at the end of the day, they achieved nothing. And in fact, I was involved in that because I was called over. I was long retired by that time, but I was called over to see the Procurator Fiscal and explain exactly what I've explained to you about how it all came about and about who was involved, what legal figures had given their approval, etc., etc. And he came back to me, he said, "Thanks very much." He said, "There'll be no further action." And no further action was taken on that case. But it was it's a daft thing to do, in my view.
Tom, traditionally, the Glasgow and Edinburgh crime scenes over the years have been quite different, with different individuals involved. But in the past 6 months, we've seen an outbreak of violence in both Edinburgh and Glasgow, linked to a feud between 2 Glasgow crime families, the Lyons and the Daniels, in which major Edinburgh crime figures have become involved and have taken sides. Has this surprised you? And what does it tell us about organised crime now? This is just the global international nature of it means that Edinburgh and Glasgow criminals are now working together rather than sort of operating separately.
Well, I find I'm a bit of a student of history and of crime, this is an inevitability. This happens when major crime groups fall out, and you see, because the people who rise to the top of these groups have got 2 big characteristics. One is they've got tremendous egos, and the second is they're absolutely paranoid. Right? So what happens is when somebody goes to jail, there's a vacancy, somebody tries to move in, somebody tries to rip off somebody, a war breaks out, and that war results in the destruction of the whole system. And the only people who are benefiting from the war between the Lyons and the Daniels and all the other people who are involved, the only people who are benefiting is Police Scotland. And the crime analysts sitting through at Gartcosh at the crime centre now will be rubbing their hands with glee because there's so much intelligence coming in. Shotts Prison is already full of people who have been arrested, and the crime bosses who have been living comfortable lives in Dubai and places like that find themselves in the local jail. Because the problem is, Norman, that I've seen it happen before. What happens is they go to war, and then they've got to find foot soldiers to carry out all these arson attacks and this and that. And of course, they don't have foot soldiers. So what they use is their drug dealers and their people who are out in the street doing their nefarious activities for them. The trouble is that these people are not best suited to the kind of tasks they're given in a war like this. And they tend to get caught. And when they get caught, they tend to talk. And so there's a bounty of intelligence that comes in, which in turn leads to the downfall of these people. And I mean, how many have been arrested? It's called Operation Portalege.
Portalege, 457, I think, at the moment.
And I think there's something like 50 or 60 arrests and a lot more in the pipeline. What interests me, Norman, is what happens next. Who moves in? Because the supply and demand, the laws of supply and demand are immutable. So if all these people are taken out of the scene, who will move in? And that's what Police Scotland will be looking at right now. Who's going to move in? Will it be foreign groups? Will it be Albanians? Will it be people from other parts of the world? Because surely somebody will move in, because if there's a demand, there will be a supply. But meanwhile, this crowd have basically self-destructed because of their drugs war. And I mean, as a spectator, it's great. It's great fun to watch it, but and it's inevitable. That's what happens.
You mentioned that they have played it in the hands of the police, haven't they? Because the police have been able to arrest people at the very top of the tree. That's not always been the case, is it? That it's been middle ranking or low-level street players, but most of the major players at the highest echelons are now behind bars or awaiting extradition from other countries.
Well, that's right. And I mean, the thing about places like Dubai, the authorities there are quite content to turn a blind eye as long as you're not attracting attention to yourself. But the minute you get involved in threatening people and your name gets bandied about, they don't want you there. They don't want you there. They don't want you in Spain. They don't want you in Dubai. And you find you get a knock on the door and you're unceremoniously dragged to the local pokey, which, by the way, will not be anything like as humane or well set up as our prison. So it's an incredible act of folly and self-destruction, but it's absolutely classic of these groups who, when they fall out, they self-destruct.
You mentioned that. You think that's what Police Scotland will be doing now, is try to find out who's going to fill the gap. You mentioned there about foreigners, Albanians, or it could be people on the ground already, part of the existing gangs stepping into the vacuum. Maybe
they will almost certainly be looking now at who's going to fill the gap and what the consequences will be. Will there be a turf war? Will there be opposing groups? Because what you do when you break down a structure like that is you stir the pot. You stir the pot, you agitate, and other things emerge. And what are the consequences of that? Will there be violent consequences? How are police going to manage it? But they will be certainly looking at who will step up.
And you think that this feud that we've talked about and has been written about, essentially it's a self-destructive feud. It's played into the hands of the police, isn't it?
Totally. The only winners from this will be Police Scotland.
I mentioned earlier about we saw the connection between individuals like Mark Richardson in Edinburgh and his links with organised crime in Glasgow and vice versa. Ross McGill, said to be the new sort of major player currently in a a prison in Dubai, said to be orchestrating events in Edinburgh and Glasgow from Dubai. Is that something you didn't see in your day, the kind of Edinburgh and Glasgow criminals working together or against
Oh no,
each other?
Edinburgh. Yes, we saw Edinburgh and Glasgow criminals working together. Quite often, what you'd find is you'd arrest a group of people and you say, "What's the connection?" You've got a guy from Ayrshire, you've got a guy from West Lothian. What's the connection? And you'd find that they'd met in prison. That was usually the connection. You could get back to they'd met in prison. So yes, we saw it, but nothing like today because distances are shorter, and we've got the internet and we've got the dark web, and a lot of the communications, and the only way that these people can control these empires from far away across the sea is through the internet. And that's another thing that the internet has brought us. Ease of communication. It's made our communication easier. It's also made the criminals' communication easier.
You mentioned earlier about the advent of heroin in the late 70s. There was various waves, and then it really took hold in the 80s. Is this current feud that we're seeing really part of that whole development over many decades?
Yeah, it's about drugs, but it's also about other contraband. Remember that the point about drugs is if drugs are not manufactured in this country, and not many of them are, they're brought in by some sort of smuggling route, some sort of contraband route, and that contraband route can be used for other things. So drugs, weapons, money, or people. So it's all about networks of communication, and it's all about contraband. And actually, if you have got a system where you can get by the security and the customs, you can use it for heroin, or you can use it for young women being brought over to be put into the nail bars and then into the sex industry. You can use it for both.
Did you, in the sort of latter part of your service in Lothian Borders as a Deputy Chief Constable, were you beginning to see the kind of escalation of organised crime? Maybe some of the names were mentioned, maybe beginning to rise. Did you see that at your time, the escalation of organised crime to the sort of international levels we see now?
Tragically, Norman, a lot of the names that I see now as being arrested and involved in organised crime, I know the names very well, but I knew their uncles and their fathers.
So it's just a generational thing, isn't it? Handing the baton over.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a generational thing, and tragically, you see it, and it doesn't say much for our justice system, but you see the same families and the same names in different generations appearing, in the courts.
And just to go back very briefly, we're talking about the vacuum that's been created by these arrests. People will be plotting at the moment to replace the individuals who now we know that are serving lengthy sentences or may well be serving lengthy sentences in the future. That's happening at the moment, isn't it?
That's right. I mean, what happens when these syndicates drop out is that, first of all, there's a lack of supply. So there's a shortage on the streets. And a shortage brings about a rise in price, and the price will go up. And as the price goes up, it becomes much more attractive for people to move into the trade. And so literally as these dealer networks fall, and as I said, I mean, our prisons just now, and it's going to be a big challenge for our prison service, Norman. I mean, this is success for Police Scotland, but success for Police Scotland is a major challenge for the Scottish Prison Service of how to keep these people and how to keep them apart. And we'll have a huge influx of long-term prisoners, all associated with different gangs and groups, and that'll mean violence, and it'll be a major challenge for the prison service.
Because these individuals are serving lengthy sentences, aren't they? We're talking about people doing life terms and 16, 18 fixed term sentences.
I mean, a lot of them, yeah. All of them are high court cases. Okay, so you're going to see double figure sentences for many of them. Young men, with not much maturity, not bounced background, who are doing long sentences, and it's going to be a major challenge. and all affiliated to different groups. So it's going to be very, very carefully managed. You're going to have to split these people up and put them in certain different prisons so as to keep them apart. So, yeah, it's a major challenge. And, of course, a very expensive challenge. Because at the end of the day, you know, our justice system in the last decade or so has been pared away in terms of money. I mean, I was reading a report the other day that there are 1,500 fewer police officers on the street today than there was in 2013 when Police Scotland was formed. 1,500 police officers less now, you know. And the prison service has been cut, the fire service has been cut. So, you know, major challenges.
Just final on that subject, that's going to be the challenge for the Scottish Prison Service, all these kind of crime figures possibly carrying out some sort of proxy feud within the prison system as well, and then they're having to deal with it.
It's going to be a huge challenge for the prison service. It is a huge challenge for the prison service because a lot of these people are now on remand, the junior players, and the major players will be extradited and they will come back eventually into the Scottish system, and it's going to be a major, long-term, ongoing problem for the Scottish prison service, and for us, because the Scottish prison service is ours, you know, and we've got to fund it properly, and we've got to make sure that they get the equipment to do the jobs, and I don't envy them the task.
Finally, Tom, just tell us a little about your own current projects at the moment. Got a few books in the pipeline. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, I've got I've written a book about the Ruxton murders, famous forensic case. I've written a book about the World's End murders, which we just discussed, which I was ended up leading. But I mean, you said in your introduction, I was instrumental in leading to the conclusion. That's not the case, Norman, because it was all done by teams of people. And the forensic scientists, and I worked with some absolutely fantastic detectives. So it's never about one person. It's always about teams of people. So I wrote about that. I've just completed a book about the bombing of Edinburgh and Leith. And I came across a unique archive of photographs about the German bombing of Edinburgh and Leith during the Second World War. A story that was very little known, but I managed to get some fantastic photographs and archive reports and just completed a book about that. Next year, I've got a book of short stories coming out about a variety of people and crimes. And then in 27, 28, I've got another major project in hand, which I'm not going to talk about just now because it's still right at the outset. But yeah, things are busy.
Thank you, Tom, for joining us. And thanks to our audience for turning into Criminal Record. If you have a question,
very nice to speak to you, and let's speak again because I've thoroughly enjoyed today, and it's good to chat to you, and it's good to air all these things, and there's an awful lot more to talk about.
Thank you, Tom, for joining us, and thanks to our audience for tuning in to Criminal Record. If you have a question for the team, you can email reporters@dailyrecord.co.uk with the subject line Criminal Record. We will be back next week. In the meantime, you can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify or Apple Podcasts by searching for Criminal Record, or you can watch it each week on our YouTube channel. Thank you.